Rajamouli's RRR was a cinematic masterpiece, technically brilliant and packed with fast-paced action. Most of the action involved the two heroes, buff South Indian alpha males, mowing down, cutting through, or otherwise eliminating wave after wave of white European men representing, one presumes, the British Colonial Army. Peak cinema by all means. The only problem, however, is that Rajamouli was taking creative liberties here, because the East India Company Army, which later became the British Indian Army and conquered large swathes of the Indian subcontinent, was not made up of just white-skinned Furangs. It overwhelmingly consisted of brown-skinned Indian men. In fact, Telugu-speaking people were among the first to sign up for the East India Company Army. This is important to understand. British conquest of India was not simply about an army of the Brits defeating an army of Indians. It was not one race subjugating another through force, like one imagines a conquest to be, for example, the Mongol-Turkic invasions of Eurasia or the Norman conquest of England. It was far more complicated than that. It was different from anything before because the British conquest of India was perhaps the first great corporate takeover in history, and it was the triumph of an idea whose time had come: capitalism. To understand its rise, we have to go back in history, to the Delhi after the death of Aurangzeb. It was 1739. Nadir Shah of Iran had just attacked the imperial capital at Delhi and carried away so much wealth that, according to legend, the Persians did not have to pay taxes for 15 years. The once great Mughal Empire was now in terminal decline. In the anarchy that followed, a market for mercenaries emerged, and several proto-empires competed against one another in this dynamic marketplace. They included the Marathas, the various splinter states of the Mughal Empire, like the Bengal Sultanate, the French, and finally the British East India Company. In this cutthroat marketplace, violence and terror were the principal services offered by every player, and the reward on offer was the fabulous wealth of India. The East India Company, which had started as a trading firm, was an unlikely entrant into this arena. The company, which had been operating since the early 17th century, began forming small armies during the later part of the 17th century, mainly for the protection of its warehouses and forts. The troop numbers were small, often only in the hundreds. It was when the Anglo-French Wars reached the shores of India, through incidents such as the siege of Fort St. George in Madras and the Carnatic Wars, that the East India Company realized it needed a real army. But they had a manpower problem. Bringing large numbers of soldiers from England was impractical. Soldiers found the climate and conditions of India hostile. Many recruits from Britain consisted of criminals and lowlifes, with undesirables like the Scots and Irish often higher in number. European colonizers quickly discovered that, without the existence of a large number of native troops, an army of Europeans could not move or subsist in the field. The enemy would only have to keep a little out of the way at first, to leave the Englishmen to follow their own strange devices, and they would all die, aided by knapsacks, crossbelts, and pipe clay. The sun and the climate would do the business most efficiently. And so, as a solution, one of the earliest outsourcing models in history emerged: Indian recruits trained in European warfare. These men, called Sepoys, were trained and drilled according to the latest European infantry practices. Recruitment was first initiated in the Madras Presidency, with Telugu agriculturist caste being the first recruits into these new redcoat armies. By the 1770s, recruitment expanded further into northern India, especially among higher caste Brahmins and peasant communities who were perceived to possess warrior traditions. Armed with fast-loading guns and the newest military technology from Europe, they became an extremely effective fighting force. Philip Mason suggested that once the British understood the value of the Indian Sepoy, they possessed the means to conquer the subcontinent. Their greatest success came at the Battle of Plassey, where Robert Clive, with a much smaller force, defeated the armies of the Nawab of Bengal. After the victory at Plassey and the acquisition of the Diwani rights of Bengal, where the tax revenues of India's richest province were effectively handed over to the British, the East India Company's imperial ambitions began to solidify. But what made the East India Company attractive to Indians? Money, of course. The company paid its soldiers 6 rupees a month, regularly and on time, often better than the average Indian warlord or king. Many Indian princes failed to pay their soldiers consistently. Armies were poorly organized, corruption was widespread, and funds meant for soldiers were often siphoned off by commanders and middlemen. In contrast, the East India Company was professional, organized, and financially disciplined. As a trading corporation, it was often more efficient than the feudal overlords of India. It also repaid creditors reliably. The Jagat Seths of Murshidabad, among the largest banking families in India at the time, financed company wars against the Nawab of Bengal. Think about that for a moment. The British won battles in India partly because they were better at accounting. Napoleon mocked the British as a nation of shopkeepers, but perhaps he underestimated what that meant. For the first time in history, an entity was winning not simply because it produced ferocious warriors, but because it balanced its books better than everyone else. Rolling in funds from Bengal's tax revenues and from Indian financiers, the East India Company was able to undertake decades of ceaseless warfare that eventually led to the conquest of India. In retrospect, to be called a nation of shopkeepers may have been the greatest compliment that could have been given to Britain. Most Indians could never see beyond their next paycheck. After all, what could go wrong? In the end, everything went wrong for India. And consequently, everything went right for good old Blighty. Over the long 18th century and the early 19th century, the East India Company army steadily expanded and outmaneuvered the established powers of the subcontinent. It was a long grind, but by the 1830s, roughly 75 years after the victory at Plassey, the company had become the supreme power in India. From a force numbering only in the hundreds at its inception, the British Indian Army had grown into a formidable military machine of nearly 300,000 men, organized into numerous regiments. The British Empire of the 19th century was built significantly by Indian soldiers under Anglo-Saxon management. Much like modern IT outsourcing models today, vast numbers of Indian men operated systems designed and controlled elsewhere. Legions of Indian soldiers, organized into regiments named after regions and communities, carried the flag first of the company and later the Union Jack across Asia and Africa. These soldiers did not only conquer India, they helped build the British Empire across Asia and Africa, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. The Indian contingent in the Opium Wars, for example, played a major role in opening China by force and beginning what the Chinese later called the Century of Humiliation. Even during the World Wars, millions of Indians fought under the British flag. More Indians died fighting for the British in the Second World War than the number of Britons killed during the London Blitz. Over 2.5 million Indians served in the war effort, forming one of the largest volunteer armies in human history. The army played a critical, though often unacknowledged, role in conflicts ranging from the capture of Haifa to campaigns in the Middle East, China, and Southeast Asia. Indian taxpayers funded enormous portions of Britain's imperial military machine. This is one of the great accounting tricks of empire. British historians often speak of imperial expansion as though Britain itself bore all the costs, but the British Indian Army was funded largely by Indian revenue. India financed the expansion of the British Empire in Asia. The colonies subsidized the empire. RRR gives us a fantasy of Indians defeating colonial oppressors, and emotionally, that fantasy resonates. But the real history is more complicated. The British did not conquer India alone. They conquered India with Indian soldiers, Indian financiers, Indian taxes, and Indian collaboration. The conquest of India was not merely the triumph of military force, but a far more modern story, a story of finance, of management, of organization, of capitalism, and of a corporation that discovered how to turn Indian manpower and Indian money into one of the greatest imperial war machines the world had ever seen.